Good morning, everyone, and welcome. This is our weekly CS-Sensei live webinar. Our webinars at the moment are held Saturday mornings at 8 a.m. Eastern Time. That's 5 a.m. West Coast Time. So you can't say you have something else going except perhaps sleep. I'm Scotty, and online we also have Chris, and we are your mentor team. Let me share my desktop here because I wanted to cover this week's topic. Also, something important for you to remember is that we are not training. Don't think of a mentorship as being where you can get your training. All I'm trying to do, all the purpose of this program is to help get you to where you understand and appreciate and hopefully love the cybersecurity career field so that you can go out and make a difference in your particular sphere of influence, go get yourself a job, those sorts of things. You will not, how do I say this? You won't be able to pass a certification exam just by watching these webinars. We are here to talk about the mindset. We're here to talk about what things are going on in current events, etc., and to help you understand that you can work within it because we've worked within it. So we share some of that. So this week we're going to talk about risk management. When we talk about risk management, the first thing people ask is, is that relevant to me? And the answer is absolutely. If you notice in your CompTIA Security Plus study guides, Domain 5 is governance, risk, and compliance. And within there is a statement that says in order to pass your exam, you should be able to summarize risk management processes and concepts. So yes, this is absolutely relevant to you, first of all, to get your entry-level certification, but second, to actually work within a cybersecurity team. So yes, it's valid to you. So when we talk about risk, a lot of people aren't really certain what that means. And also the context, risk in terms of risk for cybersecurity or risk for driving or risk for buying bread at the store, risk of, risk of mercury if you're eating tuna fish or whatever. There are lots of risks out there. So what does risk mean? Well, I tried to come up with a very simple definition, and in simplest terms, risk is the possibility of something bad happening. Now there is, this is negative risk. There is the possibility of positive risk, but for the purposes of cybersecurity, we're just talking about negative risk. So something bad happening, the possibility of it happening. And that's a good definition for risk. Now, there is something out there called risk management or enterprise risk management, and it involves identifying risks, determining the severity of each risk, and then applying any sort of risk management strategies to accept each risk. If a risk is unacceptable, then that means that something has to be done immediately in order to mitigate that risk. And we'll talk about mitigation as well as we go through it. Good morning, Ron. Good to see you.
Good morning.
There are lots of different types of risk. Remember I talked about, food risk or whatever. The main risk that you will probably be focused on are one or many of the ones that you see here. The one that I found that we tended to use the most when we were classifying our risks, we called them operational risks. You notice that on the right column. Project risks, safety risks, and business risks. We talked about those as well. And it's basically if this risk were to turn into an occurrence, who would be impacted the most? And so that's a way to think about it. what area of our organization is most concerned or should be most concerned about this risk. So there are terms that you need to know for your risk management understanding, and the main ones are threat, the vulnerability, and the risk. So think about it this way. Threat is anything that might occur that might have an adverse impact. So that means a threat is typically something external that could affect what you're doing. Vulnerability is something internal. It's your current situation or state that that has a weakness. I'll give you an example. If the CEO has trouble remembering passwords, so he writes his password down on a sticky note and puts it on his monitor in his office, that is a vulnerability, because somebody could walk in, copy that down, go somewhere else, and log in as the CEO. So that's a vulnerability. It's a weakness that could be exploited. And then the risk is actually, and I'll show a picture of it, the risk is where your threat and your vulnerability overlap. In other words, I've got 3 examples on the next slide, but it's where you have a threat and you have a vulnerability, and they intersect in some manner. For example, I'll just do some examples here. If you have a threat but no vulnerability, you have no risk. If you have a vulnerability but no threat, you have no risk. All right? Hopefully people understand that. I've got a couple examples down here. There's a new vulnerability announced that affects AutoCAD version 9, but you made sure that everybody's upgraded to AutoCAD version 11. Therefore, there is a vulnerability, but it's not within our organization, so it is no risk to our organization. The risk is 0. All right? Here's another one. There's a DDoS attack. Internet DDoS attacks are on the rise. However, we don't have any internet-facing servers. So that means internet, our servers, and they don't overlap. All right? Our servers are not on the internet and can't be reached from the internet. So that's no risk. And here's the last one. Windows 7 is no longer being patched by Microsoft. However, we've made sure that everybody in our organization is now on Windows 10 or Windows 11. We do not have Windows 7 in our enterprise, so there is no risk. Okay, does that make sense? Anybody have any questions on that? Good morning, Harminder. Anybody have any questions on that? If you have a threat, I'll back it up. If you have a threat but no vulnerability, you have no risk. If you have a vulnerability but no threat, there is no risk. So your risk is 0. Go ahead, Harminder.
Okay. So I understand the vulnerability risk. Can you explain me about a little bit of threat? So I join, please. Yeah, thank you.
Sure. A threat is that we have looked out in the cybersecurity news, and somebody says that there is a new exploited threat. In other words, something that they found out in, let's say, Cisco routers. And someone is out there exploiting those routers on the internet. It's an active exploit that's already underway, which means that today, your router, if you have a internet-facing Cisco router, the threat is that somebody could attack your router and be successful with this new vulnerability that has been identified. So the threat is, if you think about it, somebody on the outside who could get into our systems. The vulnerability is ways that we could inadvertently allow them into our systems. A vulnerability is something that you think of in terms of our status. A threat is where you think about what could happen. What is occurring elsewhere, or you've read about it, or there's an announcement for a new 0-day that they've discovered, those sorts of things. Those are threats. The vulnerability is your ability to be affected by that threat. Does that help a little?
Yes, got it. Yes, got it. Thank you. Yes, it is clear.
Good question, though. That's just basically all you needed to understand, just so long as you know what constitutes a risk. So there are typical risk management steps. Number one, you recognize the risks. You hear about them, you read about them, someone tells you, someone sends you a notification, something is announced on the threat matrix, attack.org, those sorts of things. So you recognize it, you characterize the risk, you evaluate the significance of the risk. In other words, is it a big risk for us, or is it a little risk for us? Is it very likely, or is it not very likely? That's what you mean when you say evaluate risk significance. And we'll talk about that in later slides. But then you decide how to address it. So I guess the important thing for us to remember is that if you aren't aware of a risk, that doesn't mean it's not out there. That just means you haven't done your homework. So it's always important for you in terms of risk management to be thinking about every possible risk, everything. And I'll give an example. I was in the Pentagon as Donald Rumsfeld's IT program manager, and I ran the risk register for the Secretary of Defense IT support team. And I did not put a risk in there. I'll admit it. I didn't put a risk in there that says someone flies an airplane into the Pentagon. And yet it happened. So that, someone who was forward thinking could have successfully argued that there is the possibility that someone will hijack a plane and fly it into the Pentagon, because there were people making threats against the United States, our infrastructure, our way of life here, and making threats against it. So I missed out because I didn't put that risk into our risk log. Then again, there were other more likely risks that we tracked every single day. So,
hey Scotty, is it a good best practice to think of all the risks that could happen? I think I remember reading in a few textbooks that, yeah, you should think of all the risks no matter how ridiculous, I don't want to use that word, but how less likely it could happen.
Yes. Yes, the answer is if you don't know about it, that's your fault. Mm-hmm. So you should always be applying a systems level lens to this. For example, let's say you have a Windows environment running Cisco routers. Very typical. But you also have somebody who says, well, I need to have these brocade routers added because of, they're cheap or whatever. And then someone else says, yeah, I like Windows, but I like Mac better. I want an iPad Pro to use as my desktop computer. So now you're not only talking about a Windows environment with Cisco, you're talking about a Windows and iPad environment, iOS environment with Cisco and Brocade. Even one of those items in your overall enterprise means that you have to take into account the risks that you now have because you have that equipment. You know, it's nice and easy when everybody's on Windows, but what if your CEO demands to have a Mac? Now you have to evaluate Mac risks as well. So yes, you should always try and envision every possible risk. I will tell you that I used to run, like I said, I ran the risk register for the Secretary of Defense. I ran the risk register for National Defense University. These were all IT, which included cybersecurity. And I ran the risk register for, let's see, who else? Oh, for our contract at the Enterprise Service Desk at the Department of Labor. And a typical risk register, a robust risk register, probably has between 100 and 200 risks listed. Okay, so we're not talking a couple. We're talking, you know, what happens if, well, pandemic. What happens if everybody gets sick? How do we keep up operations if everyone gets sick? That should be in your risk register. All right? So that's just something to think about as you're going along. Always think big. Always think broad lens for this. Okay? Here's just a quick visual of the same thing that I mentioned in the previous slide. Establish the context, identify the risk, analyze the risk, evaluate the risk, treat the risk, and then monitor. Treat the risk is where you apply mitigation. Can anybody, besides Chris, can anybody tell me what mitigation means? If somebody says we're mitigating that, what am I saying?
Yes, mitigation means how we remove the risk, how we mitigate the risk we don't get in the future. So the techniques we are implement to mitigation to remove the risk, how we don't apply the security patches, boundaries, we can get such kind of risk in the future.
Okay, you are almost entirely right, Harminder. When you say mitigation, let's say there's a new patch that has to be applied on 100 workstations, and you are able to get it applied to 99 of those workstations. Have you applied mitigation, even though there's still one that's not affected?
Mitigate.
I'll answer for you.
It will totally remove. No. We have to be apply a 10th one, 100 ones too.
Okay, but yes. The point of if you think about mitigation, mitigation isn't always the complete elimination of the risk. It's turning the risk from a high risk to a low risk maybe, or from a high to a medium, but it may not be total elimination. So think of mitigation as making less, making from a higher risk to a lower risk, rather than eliminating it entirely. Because frequently, you will not be able to say that you've eliminated everything, but you are still doing lots of work to reduce those risks. Okay? So mitigation, mitigation means reducing the risk. Possibly eliminating, but think of mitigation as reducing. Okay?
Okay, got it.
Now, at the bottom, I put down this little suggestion here. We should always encourage a risk-aware culture within our teams, within our clients. Everybody should feel that they are empowered to look around and say, hey, this window, this unlocked window is not a good thing on the ground floor of our server room, for example. You may not have even thought about it, but because your janitor is walking past, sees an unlocked window and millions of dollars of servers there, says, hey, that is a possibility of a risk. Bring it to your attention and you do something to address it. Maybe lock the door or lock the window. So when you talk about risk management, it's helpful to remind everyone in the environment that they can help with risk management by identifying what they believe to be risks. Everyone can help because you can't see everything all the time. You have the capability of missing out on things. So tell everyone, be aware that if you see a risk or see what you think is a risk, bring it up, please, and listen to what they say. That's a good practice for risk management. So there are a number of what we'll call strategies for risk management, and you need to know these. The ones that are in yellow, you need to know these for your Security Plus exam. But there's what's called risk acceptance. First of all, you've determined that there is a risk. Then you ask yourself, what are we going to do about the risk? That's called risk management, and here's some of the things that you can do. You can accept the risk. In other words, you say, well, the likelihood of it happening is low, or the impact of it happening is low. It'll only affect our backups. Okay, well then it won't affect operations. We won't lose money if this risk turns into an event. So okay, number one is risk acceptance. Number two is risk avoidance. And what that means is, for example, going back to our Windows and Mac example, where somebody says, well, I want to have a Mac in your Windows environment, so now automatically you have to start thinking about Mac risk as well. Well, maybe you can talk that person out of their Mac and figure out what exactly they need and try and address their need with a system that fits within your risk posture. So risk avoidance would be talk the guy out of getting a Mac. That's risk avoidance. You stay away from that risk by not incorporating it into your activities. Another one is risk transference. This gets a lot of airplay these days because it sounds really simple. Oh, well, we'll just buy cyber insurance, and therefore, if something happens, we don't lose as much money. The issue is when you're doing any sort of cybersecurity insurance, they are your insurer, before they sign on the dotted line to underwrite your activity, your project, your company, before they underwrite you, they're going to perform a full risk analysis with you to determine just what the risks are and just how much they might cost and just how likely they might occur. So risk transference does not mean that you don't have to do a management for that risk. This just means that instead of applying risk mitigation, you're going to pay somebody in case that risk occurs. And cyber insurance is going through the roof these days. So you have to be really careful. You are basically paying somebody in the hopes that nothing will happen. And cyber insurance is very difficult to impress on your CEO or CFO from an organizational standpoint. So risk transference does occur. I was at the CyberSecurity, what's it called, summit in May over in Phoenix, and there were numerous cybersecurity insurance providers in that summit. And they, some of them spoke up and said, "This is what we do. This is how we do it. Contact us if you want to talk, etc." Well, okay, that sounds good, but there's money involved. So you have to literally put insurance into your budget for your organization. Well, I thought you were a cyber company. I thought you were going to, make sure that we don't have these things occur. Well, and so that's the whole conversation. So transference is tricky.
It is.
It's very tricky because you have to convince somebody that something might happen, and so they have to invest in the fact that it may happen, but not do anything to try and stop it from happening.
Hey, Scotty, I would say that if you go into a cybersecurity insurance with the mindset that they're going to prevent everything, that's the wrong mindset to go into it. Risk transference means that, hey, I don't want Oxford Industries to be liable if a cybersecurity incident happens. Therefore, I go to Ward's cyber insurance company to say, hey, Ward Cyber Insurance Company, I don't want to be liable for this anymore. What do I need to do? Okay, give me $1 million, and I'm throwing a figure out of the air.
Yeah.
And you need to do A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Oh, by the way, with that $1 million, I can do A, B, C, D, E, F. G and H, I don't have that capabilities, but you may have that capabilities, and that's what we suggest you do if you want to keep our insurance. And if an incident happens, we'll take the liability, and we got lawyers we have lawyers that can protect you from that part.
Yeah,
that's the way I figure what transfer is. But feel free to say, Chris, you're off your rocker here.
No, that's a very good way of describing it, Chris. I would say cyber insurance should be somewhere within your stock of tools, but it should not ever be your first tool. You should first look at how do we make this risk not so much of a risk. And that's number 4 here on the screen, risk mitigation. And like I said, Harminder, decrease the risk level by investing in tools, increasing, hiring a specialist in this particular thing or whatever. Those are all part of risk mitigation. And it is, I would say it's rare that you can say your risk is entirely eliminated. But it does happen. I did close risks. We have a risk of this thing happening within this period of time, and when the time passes, then that risk can close. You reevaluate to see, if it's going to happen at a later time, but if the time period has passed, you say, in the month of June, we could get hacked by this particular group that said they're going to attack all companies like me in June. After June, you reevaluate and say, is this still a risk? If not, close the risk. Leave it on your roster. Never take a risk off the roster. But you can say, this is, we have evaluated and determined that at the moment this does not pose a sufficient enough risk to leave it active on the risk register. Okay? So mitigation means to decrease, and that's where you do most of your work. That's where you have your tools. That's where you have your client cybersecurity awareness training. That's where you have your phishing exercises. All of those are in risk mitigation. Okay? So now there's this thing called risk appetite versus risk tolerance. A risk appetite basically says that you can read it on the screen, the amount of risk an organization is willing to accept to achieve its objectives. Now, of course, you may say, oh, well, I don't want to accept any risk. Well, that's a good approach, but the cost necessary to get to a zero risk capability, a zero risk posture, is just incredibly massive. I remember a number of years ago, someone hired a company to assemble, to design a risk-proof desktop computer. Risk-proof. And they designed it, but it was in a locked room, it was off the network, and it had, only a certain number of people could log into it, and they could only perform a certain number of tasks, and that was it. The risk was things like being on the internet, Well, if you want to get rid of being on the internet, sure, you can get rid of that risk. Otherwise, you have to manage to that risk. So your risk appetite is how much of these things can we comfortably allow in our environment on a day-to-day basis. So those are things like the print vulnerability. It is still out there, the Windows print vulnerability, but we have applied mitigation in the form of, let's say, around our enclave, our border routers all block those particular ports and those particular commands from coming in across the internet. And so therefore the Windows print vulnerability is greatly reduced. So we've moved it, you see the coloration, we've moved it from a yellow down into the green level, and we can operate today with that level of risk. That's called your risk appetite. Risk tolerance is where you get into places where it's more concerning for your management, and those are the things you talk about in your risk reviews. Quarterly or we used to do it monthly. We would go through all the risks, and then quarterly we would review it with our federal government management. We would go through all the risks from top to bottom, every single risk, and say, is this still a risk? And is it still this probability, this impact? Have there been any changes to this risk? And then you resort them. I'll show you how to do that in another slide. But you resort them and say these are the highest priority risks based on their highest severity, the most severe risks. And that's part of your risk tolerance, because you're going to say, we should do this. And somebody's going to say, well, yeah, but that takes a couple $1 million that we don't have right now. So yes, it's a risk. No, we can't really do anything to mitigate against it, so we have to tolerate it. And that risk tolerance is where you get uncomfortable. Think about it that way. Your management are uncomfortable, but they don't have the resources, they don't have maybe the capability. Something has been announced, but nobody knows how to fix it yet, or something like that. That gets into the risk tolerance, where we are not comfortable having this here. First thing we need to do is plan to get this from a yellow down into the green to where it becomes part of our overall risk appetite. All right? Managing risks, always working them to lower numbers. And then unacceptable risks are things like zero-day vulnerabilities. Microsoft announces a zero-day in, let's say, their Microsoft 365 product, and guess what? You have 20,000 people running Microsoft 365 that are vulnerable. You've done an evaluation of what they announced and said, ooh, this does apply to us. So you now have 20,000 people that need your help so that your organization is no longer vulnerable. That is called an unacceptable risk. Those are the things where they say, this must not stay here. In its current form, we can't keep going on with this. That would also be, let's say, an active, well, no, not an active, but let's say a threatened attack. They're hitting everybody in the dairy industry. Everybody. And, they're going alphabetically, and we're the L's. They've gotten to the J's. We've got a little space, but they're coming. So that's what's called unacceptable risk, and that's where you have to apply resources immediately to address that risk. That's where you pull somebody off a lower priority project, put them on your higher priority project to address an unacceptable risk. Make sense? Any questions? This is not everything, but this is a basic orientation in how to do risk management. You need to know about this for your Security Plus and to perform in your organization. Now, there are two main tools. One is called a risk matrix. I'll show you one. And the other is called a risk register or risk log. A risk matrix is pretty simple. You lay out, and I normally do it in a 5x5 block, just like we see on the screen. And you say, what is the likelihood that this is going to occur? And what is the consequence or impact or destructiveness or whatever if something does occur? So how likely is it, and how likely is it going to occur, and then how bad if it does? So what you have to do is every single risk has two factors. You rate the likelihood from it exceedingly rare that it's going to occur up to it's almost certain it's going to occur. That's 1 through 5. And then the consequence is it's a minor thing. It's going to turn everybody's background blue. Compared to it's catastrophic, it's going to expose all of our financial records and empty our bank accounts or whatever. So you rate everything from a 1 to 5, 1 being low, 5 being high. And then you put it on this matrix and you give it a color. So you say if something is a number 3, it's possible, the likelihood is possible, and the consequence is moderate. You have a 3 and a 3. You look there on the screen and it says 9. Okay, 3 times 3, probability 3, consequence 3, you have a 9. And you give it an orange color. All right? And that's how you arrange all of your risks. Every single risk, you look at the probability, you look at the impact, and by the way, they can change. So that's why you have to go through your risk register periodically and look at all of the risks and say, oh, well, this was a higher probability, but now that they've applied the patch and verified that they're 100% coverage, this will drop from a 4, let's say, to a 2, from likely to unlikely. And that changes the coloration so that it could go from, let's say, a red or an orange down to a yellow, maybe, or maybe even green. All right? So that's a risk matrix. It's pretty simple. Just arrange it by probability and consequence. Probability 1 through 5, consequence 1 through 5. Multiply those two together, and you have, they call it a severity, and I'll show it here. Severity rating. This is a risk register. It's not the greatest risk register. I looked and I was not able to find a really good risk register out there. But it has some columns that you should include. One is an identifier, because you may have one that involves human resources, but then another that involves human resources, and another that involves human resources, and they're going to say, which one are we talking about? Oh, well, this is, pandemic. This is a hiring freeze. This is inability to get the right skills hired. Those sorts of things. Each one of those is HR, but they're not the same. So have an identifier so you can go to that risk and know which one you're talking about. The date that it was raised, in other words, the date that you first put this risk onto this risk register, that won't change. The ID number, the date won't change. The risk description probably will not change, but maybe it will. And state the risk, and I'll talk about this in a later slide, but state the risk in terms of what if it happens. And I'll give you an example a little bit later. But if you take a look at our two colored columns, you see the likelihood, you see the impact, which is the consequence. You multiply those two together and it says, what is the severity? You combine the two to reach what's called your severity. Then once you have all of that, it's probably a good thing to say, okay, let's take a look at the reds and the oranges and the yellows today, but we're not going to talk about the greens because we don't have time. In other words, if it's down in the green area, we will worry about it at some point. But right now, let's worry about the ones that are higher likelihood or higher consequence if they do occur. Start with those. Your time is not unlimited, so start with the things that could have the greatest impact on your organization. And you do that by sorting these by color. That's the way I would do it. So don't sort it by the date, sort it by the color. All right? Every risk has an owner. In other words, if I'm the guy that's parking the cars in the parking lot, am I responsible if my password is not secure? And the answer is probably not. My supervisor might be, but I'm not. It's just poor security practices. Let's say I have a Mac and I don't patch it, but it's on your enterprise. My Mac on your enterprise could mean that you bear the risk for compromise because of my unpatched Mac. So the owner is the person who will manage the risk, not always the person that applies the mitigation actions. For example, somebody says that computer has to be taken offline. And so that's like the CISO saying it's an extremely unpatched system, high likelihood that it's going to get hacked within the next hour. Go get somebody to replace that system. The owner is the one that you report to and say, this is what we're doing. We're replacing a system. You're not the owner of that. You're doing the work. But then what about the help desk person that goes and replaces the system? They're not the owner either. The owner is the one that's responsible if the risk occurs. All right, so think about it that the one who manages the risk, they're also the people that have to go up and determine whether things like a budget needs to be put in. We have to spend $200,000 on this tool. Why? Well, let me show you in the risk register why. Okay? The owner is the person who ultimately manages the risk. That could be, like it shows here, the project sponsor, could be the project manager, could be your CEO, could be your CISO. And then the last column you always apply is mitigating actions. What do we do to move this from a 20 to a 12 in terms of severity? How do we bring this risk down to a more manageable level? What actions do we need to apply? And you have some examples right there. That is a risk register. I know it sounds boring, but if you don't do it, you have not contemplated all of the risks in one basket together, because you're only going to have so many resources. You're only going to have so much time. So you should always focus on the risks that are higher in terms of severity and get to the lower severity ones when you have time. Like I was saying, we did our risk assessments every quarter with our managers, but every month we would do it with our team to make sure that all the risks were still arranged properly, were still identified, were still quantified properly. And if we noticed anything that changed, we would notify our leads, our management, and say, this might warrant us having an earlier meeting to talk about this risk. So imagine having routine risk evaluations with the risk team, in this case like the project manager, but then quarterly talking to your sponsor, could be the CISO, to say, here are our risks that we've identified. We've racked and stacked them according to the current likelihood and the current impact, and here's how they stack out, or here's how they arrange themselves. All right? Any questions on that? Cool. here is the biggest nugget that I can give you. When you're doing, and by the way, many risk practitioners don't get this right. State your risk in terms of it actually occurring. Instead of saying, we have poor password security, that's a risk. No, the actual risk is the service account password is guessed. That's the risk. So always state your risk in terms of the actual event occurring. We have a intrusion using a SQL buffer overrun on our SQL server that holds all of our corporate records. That is a real bona fide risk that you can then apply mitigation to. But if you say we have poor password security, how do you know when poor password security is not going to be poor password security? Very difficult to quantify, very difficult to put into any sort of budget, and very difficult to come up with the proper tools to change that to mitigate that poor password security. But service account password is guessed. Your mitigation should be very easily guessed in that. If the service account password could be guessed, what is the mitigation? Anybody have ideas for what mitigations could we apply if the service account password is guessed?
A stronger password, so where it cannot be guessed.
Number one, stronger password. How about more frequently change the passwords? Have fewer people have knowledge of the passwords. Give fewer people access to the service accounts. Yes, all of those mitigate, reduce that likelihood of that staying a high risk. Yep.
Hey, Scotty, can I see if I understand what you're trying to say here?
Okay.
So if I say the firewall is an outdated version, that's not good.
No.
That's not a risk that's being actually occurring. The risk of actually occurring would be the firewall version is 20. The newest version is 22. Or someone, or I'll probably put it better, is someone has bypassed the firewall using port whatever.
Okay.
You should probably close that port.
Right.
Maybe I'm not understanding what that is, and that's why I'm asking.
I think you're on the right track. Think about it this way. If you changed from version 20 to version 22, there must have been a reason why you did so. The reason why is that in version 20, they discovered that they had a password buffer overrun issue. And they went to version 21 and then 22, and your organization is planning on going to 22, but until that occurs, you still have the risk of password buffer overrun.
So you say the specific activity that happens,
right?
That the patch fixed that flaw. Okay, no, that makes better sense. Okay.
And then in your mitigation actions, you would say upgrade from version 20 to version 22. Okay? Always try and state it in terms of the risk turning into an incident. That will allow you to be able to be much more precise when you're explaining it to your boss and trying to get money or resources or a specialist to handle it. You can actually hire somebody, hey, we need you to upgrade us from version 20 to version 22. That's a mitigation action too. Okay, make sense?
Yes.
Okay, that's really all I had for today. I hope you all, didn't get too tired watching me because this it can seem boring, but if you don't do it, you are not actively pursuing a better environment, all you're doing is trying to plug a hole. Oh, I see this vulnerability. Let's attack this one. Oh, here's another one. Let's attack this one. Oh, here's another one. Let's attack this one. And after a while, all of your resources are committed, but you still don't know how secure you are. Well, we've patched this. We've patched this. We've patched this. We've removed this obsolete equipment. Okay, but does that, how do I say this? As a defender, you have to be right 100% of the time, right? As an attacker, they only need to be right once. So when you look at everything, you have to consider all possible risks that you can identify. There may be some you don't know about, but that's why risk management, I consider risk management to be kind of fun, because it allows you to look at everything and say, wow, maybe there is a real benefit to us requiring certain performance characteristics in our client workstations that I never even considered before. They have to be able to handle this security tool. So that means we've got to increase the RAM in all of our client workstations, because that's what this security tool requires. You know, you never even thought about it before you did your risk assessment and you chose a mitigation action, which includes that tool, and it says, by the way, client workstations have to have this RAM. Oh, do we? You know, those sorts of things. So I will just say, speaking personally, risk may sound boring, but it's something you must do. You can't just treat individual items and think that you have a secure posture. Make sense? Any questions? That's all I had for the day. Any questions?
Yeah, when you do your monthly risk assessments, how many people are involved in that?
Typically, it's the workers, the people that are probably the ones that are going to be tasked with applying the mitigation actions or whatever. You get the workers together, not the managers. And the workers sit around and say, you know, what about this? What about this? What about this? Is this still a problem for us? So it should only be people who understand risk management, and they're not the ones that are going to make the decisions. They're going to take this risk register and show it to management. The management are going to say, we need to apply resources against that to turn it from an orange down to a green. If we do this, if we purchase this product within, you know, we can get it within 60 days, have it fully implemented and controlled or configured within 120 days. Within 120 days, this orange finding risk will move down into the green level. We will have mitigated this risk. But the management have to look at all the risks together. So what you do is you show them the ones that are the highest severity, most likely to occur, or most impactful if they do. Don't show them everything. Well, gee, what if the CEO actually does get an Android phone and everybody else has iPhones? Well, he doesn't have one yet. It's not a risk. I mean, it's a possible risk. If the CEO says he wants an Android, then you have to assess it in terms of risk. And your CISO should make that decision, not you. But you should bring it to your CISO's attention. That's a risk. Okay? So the monthly review is probably the people that are tasked with managing your risk roster. When we did it back when I was with the service desk, it was 2 of us that did it every month. And once a quarter, we had all of the leadership and we presented a slide presentation of all of the highest risks, 1 risk per slide. We talked about it, went to the next one, talked about it, went to the next one, talked about it, and we ordered them in terms of severity. And so you would focus on like the 5 highest severity risks. Those would be the ones that your CISO is considering money for, asking for a budget change, and those sorts of things. Well, what if you don't have a budget? Maybe trying to reprogram resources. Can you guys lend us somebody until we can get the money to do this? Those sorts of things. Those all come into play on when you use the mitigation column. What can we do to make this red not a red? Okay? Make sense?
Makes sense to me.
I hope you guys enjoyed this. I'm going to put this recording up so you can review it later. But the point is, if you are looking at all risks all together, then you are actually looking into what's called risk management. It's not just little tiny risk. It's all of the risks together, because your organization has probably a lot of vulnerabilities and there are a lot of threats. When the vulnerability is inside, the threat is outside. Think about it that way. When they intersect, you have your risk, and that's what you are trying to identify, quantify, and then apply mitigation actions toward. Thanks, everybody. I hope you all have a great Saturday.
Scotty, before we leave, risk management is actually a great foot into the door in cybersecurity. It's called governance, risk, and compliance.
Yep.
And my last check on LinkedIn, I put risk management as a skill just to search to see what jobs are out there, who's looking for that risk management. About 1,700 positions looking for someone with skills with risk management. And keep in mind, that's just one skill.
Yep.
There's probably other skills that these people want or these companies want. It's something for you guys to consider if you're looking for your first position.
Mm-hmm.
And now you have knowledge of risk management, so you can say it on your resume.
Yep.
You have knowledge of risk management.
Knowledge of risk management. You know how it works. I would recommend that you go through your study guide as well. They cover this in more depth. But yes, absolutely. Don't shy away from risk management. Don't ignore risk management, because it'll come around and bite you. All right, guys. Thanks, everybody. Hope you have a great Saturday.